The sound of breaking glass followed Josephine Lawrence into the dusty Oklahoma street, and she did not look back even as her former employer screamed threats from the doorway of the saloon. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth where his ring had split her lip, but she kept moving, her worn boots kicking up clouds of red dirt as she stumbled toward the edge of Enid. It was July 1889, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the newly established town that had sprung up practically overnight during the land run just 3 months prior. She had come here hoping to disappear, to become just another face among the thousands of settlers scrambling to claim their piece of the unassigned lands. Instead, she had found herself trapped in the same situation she had fled from in Missouri, working for a man who thought her desperation gave him the right to put his hands on her whenever he pleased. Today, when she had finally fought back, shoving him away hard enough that he had crashed into his precious mirror, she knew there would be consequences. Josephine's threadbare dress clung to her back with sweat as she made her way past the hastily constructed buildings that lined the main street. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins during the struggle, hanging in tangled waves past her shoulders. At 22 years old, she had already lived through more than most people experienced in a lifetime. The bruises on her arms told only part of the story, the visible evidence of what she was running from. She had no horse, no money, and nowhere to go. The Oklahoma Territory stretched endlessly in every direction, offering both freedom and danger in equal measure. Behind her, she could hear voices rising, men gathering outside the saloon. Her former employer was likely rallying others to teach her a lesson about putting her hands on her betters. In a place like this, where law was still finding its footing and might often made right, a woman alone had few protections. Josephine quickened her pace, her breath coming faster now as panic began to set in. She passed the last building on the edge of town, the general store with its faded paint and crooked sign, and found herself on the open prairie with nothing but knee-high grass and the occasional scraggly tree in sight. The voices behind her grew louder, and she broke into a run despite the heat that seemed to press down on her like a physical weight. Her lungs burned and her side ached, but she pushed forward, knowing that stopping meant facing whatever punishment those men had in mind. The grass caught at her skirts, and twice she nearly fell, catching herself at the last moment and continuing on. She had no plan, no destination, only the desperate need to get away. That was when she saw him. He sat astride a large bay horse about 50 yards ahead, seemingly appearing out of nowhere on the empty prairie. The man wore a dusty brown hat pulled low against the sun, and even from a distance, she could see the easy way he sat in the saddle, as if he and the horse were one creature. He was not moving, just watching her stumbling approach with what seemed like calm interest. Josephine's steps faltered. She glanced back over her shoulder and saw 4 men emerging from the edge of town, moving in her direction with clear purpose. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked forward again at the stranger on horseback. She had no reason to think he would help her, no reason to believe he was any different from the men she was running from. But she had run out of options. She changed direction slightly, angling toward him, and as she drew closer, she could make out more details. He was perhaps 28 or 30, with sun-weathered skin and a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard. His clothes were worn but well cared for, a blue work shirt and brown vest over denim pants. A gun belt hung at his hip, and a coiled rope was attached to his saddle. His eyes, she saw as she came within 20 feet of him, were a startling shade of blue-green, like water in a clear creek. "Please," she gasped out, her voice cracking from thirst and exertion. "Please, they're coming." The cowboy's gaze shifted past her to the approaching men, then back to her face. His expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. For a terrible moment, Josephine thought he might simply ride off and leave her to her fate. Then he spoke, and his voice was deep and steady, with a slight Texas drawl that softened the edges of his words. "You running from your past, miss?" "Yes," she said, because it was true in more ways than he could know. "Please, I did nothing wrong. He tried to force himself on me and I pushed him away, that's all. I just pushed him away." The cowboy was quiet for another moment, his eyes studying her torn dress, her split lip, the terror in her expression. Then he looked at the approaching men again, who had closed half the distance and showed no signs of slowing. When he looked back at her, something had shifted in his face, a hardness settling around his eyes and mouth. "Run toward me instead," he said simply, and held out his hand. Josephine did not hesitate. She grabbed his hand and felt the callous strength in his grip as he pulled her up behind him in one smooth motion. She had barely gotten her arms around his waist when he urged the horse forward, not away from the men but directly toward them. "Wait," she started to say, confused and frightened, but he cut her off. "Hold tight." The bay horse moved from a standstill to a gallop in seconds, eating up the ground between them and her pursuers. Josephine clung to the cowboy's back, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt and the confident way he moved with the horse. As they closed the distance, she could make out the faces of the men. Her former employer, Marcus Hendricks, was in front, his face purple with rage. The other three were regulars at his saloon, rough men who would do whatever he paid them to do. The cowboy did not slow down. At the last possible second, he guided the horse between two of the men, so close that Josephine felt the fabric of someone's shirt brush against her leg. One of the men lunged for her, but the cowboy shifted his weight and the horse responded instantly, dancing sideways and leaving the man grasping at empty air. "That's my property you have got there," Marcus Hendricks shouted, spittle flying from his mouth. "That woman owes me for damages, and she is going to pay one way or another." The cowboy finally reined in the horse about 10 feet past the group, turning so they could face the men. His hand rested casually on his thigh, close to his gun but not touching it. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly despite its conversational volume. "She does not look like property to me. She looks like a woman, and I do not see any law here saying she has to go with you." "This is none of your business, stranger," one of the other men said, stepping forward. He was built like a bull with a thick neck and meaty fists. "Hand her over and ride on. This does not concern you." "She asked me for help," the cowboy replied, his tone still calm. "That makes it my business. Now I suggest you boys head back to town and cool off. Nothing good is going to come from you following her any further." Marcus Hendricks laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "You think you can stand against 4 of us, over some saloon girl who is not worth the trouble?" Josephine felt the cowboy's back straighten slightly, his body tensing in a way that suggested coiled energy ready to spring. "I think you should ask yourselves if whatever you are planning is worth dying for. Because I promise you, if you make me draw this gun, at least 2 of you are not going to walk away. Maybe all 4, if I am having a good day. So you need to ask yourselves which 2 are willing to pay that price." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Josephine could feel her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. The men looked at each other, and she saw the calculation happening behind their eyes. The cowboy had not made any threats or boasts, had not tried to sound tough or scary. He had simply stated facts in that same steady voice, and somehow that made it all the more believable. It was the bull-necked man who broke first, taking a step back. "This is not worth getting shot over, Marcus. Let her go. There are plenty of other girls." "She broke my mirror," Marcus sputtered, but Josephine could hear that the fire had gone out of his anger, replaced by uncertainty. "That mirror cost me good money." "Then take it up with the law," the cowboy said. "But I am guessing you do not want to do that, seeing as how you would have to explain why your employee felt the need to defend herself in the first place. Territory marshals tend to frown on men who force themselves on women." Marcus's face went from purple to bright red. For a moment, Josephine thought he might charge forward anyway, consequences be damned. But then he spat on the ground and turned away, waving dismissively at his companions. "She was not worth what I was paying her anyway. Let her freeze or starve out here. I do not care." The four men trudged back toward town, and the cowboy did not move until they had disappeared from sight. Only then did Josephine feel some of the tension leave his body. He shifted slightly in the saddle and spoke over his shoulder. "You can let go now, miss. They are gone." Josephine realized she was still clutching his shirt with white-knuckled intensity and quickly released her grip, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I am sorry. I did not mean to." "No need to apologize. You were scared. That is understandable." He paused, then added, "I am Franklin Wakefield, by the way. Most people call me Frank." "Josephine Lawrence," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone calls me Josie." Frank turned the horse and began riding away from town at an easy walk, heading roughly northeast across the prairie. Josephine wanted to ask where they were going, what his plan was, but the words stuck in her throat. She was suddenly aware of how close she was pressed against this stranger's back, how improper the situation was. But propriety seemed like a distant concern when compared to the fact that he had just saved her from a beating or worse. After several minutes of silence, Frank spoke without looking back at her. "That man in town, Hendricks, was he telling the truth about you working for him?" "Yes," Josie admitted. "I worked in his saloon, serving drinks, cleaning tables, nothing else despite what he wanted." She swallowed hard. "I came to Enid during the land run, hoping to make a fresh start. I had some money saved, enough to file a claim, but it was stolen my first night here. I had to take whatever work I could find just to survive." "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri. Near Jefferson City." She hesitated, then added, "I left because my father arranged a marriage for me to a man who had already buried 2 wives under mysterious circumstances. I refused, and he locked me in my room, said I would learn obedience one way or another. So I climbed out the window one night and never looked back." Frank was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. "How long ago was that?" 8 months. I have been moving from town to town, working where I could, always worried someone would come looking for me. My father is a prominent man in his community. He does not like to be defied. And has anyone come looking for you? Not that I know of. I think he told people I ran off with a traveling salesman or some other scandalous story to save face. He would rather have people think I am shameful than admit his daughter chose freedom over obedience." They rode in silence for a while longer. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and the heat of the day was finally starting to ease. Josie could see nothing but grass in every direction, though the land rolled and dipped in gentle waves that created the illusion of privacy despite the openness. Finally, she could not stand the uncertainty any longer. "Where are you taking me?" "My place," Frank said simply. "I've got a ranch about 12 miles northeast of Enid. Nothing fancy, just a small cabin and some grazing land I claimed in the run. I run about 40 head of cattle and do some bronc breaking on the side." He paused, then continued, "I am not making any assumptions here, miss. When I say I am taking you to my place, I mean I am taking you somewhere safe where you can rest and figure out your next move. I've got a spare room and plenty of food." You can stay as long as you need." Josie felt tears prick at her eyes, sudden and unexpected. After months of suspicion and hardship, of men who wanted things from her and women who judged her for being alone, this stranger's simple kindness felt overwhelming. "Why are you helping me? You do not know anything about me. I could be lying about everything." Frank was quiet for so long that Josie thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My mother spent the last 3 years of her life running from my father. He was a hard man, quick with his fists and his belt. She finally got the courage to leave when I was 14, took my younger sister and me with her. We went from town to town, never staying long, always afraid he would find us." His voice was matter of fact, but Josie could hear the old pain beneath the words. "He caught up to us in Fort Worth. Beat my mother so badly she never really recovered. She died 6 months later from injuries the doctor said should have healed." "Oh God," Josie whispered, "I am so sorry. I was too young to help her then, too small to stand against him, but I am not too young anymore and I am not too small. So when I see a woman running from a man who wants to hurt her, I do not look the other way. I will not be that person." Josie did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They rode on as the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The prairie seemed endless, but Frank moved across it with the confidence of someone who knew every hill and hollow. He pointed out landmarks occasionally, a distinctive rock formation here, a lone cottonwood tree there, storing them away for future reference. "What happened to your sister?" Josie asked after a while. "She is married to a good man in San Antonio. They have got 3 children now. I visit when I can, but mostly I stay here. This land is mine, earned fair and square in the run. It is the first thing I have ever owned that nobody can take away from me." As twilight began to deepen into full darkness, Josie saw a faint light in the distance. Frank guided the horse toward it, and gradually a small homestead took shape. The cabin was modest but well built, constructed from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney at one end. There was a small barn nearby, and a corral held several horses that whinnied as Frank approached. A couple of dogs came bounding out of the darkness, barking enthusiastically until they recognized their master. "Easy, Rex." "Down, Blue," Frank commanded, and the dogs immediately calmed, tails wagging as they circled the horse. He dismounted first, then turned and offered his hand to help Josie down. Her legs felt unsteady after the long ride, and she stumbled slightly. Frank caught her elbow, steadying her. "Give it a minute. Your muscles need to remember how to work." Josie nodded, not trusting her voice. Now that they had arrived, the enormity of the situation was settling over her. She was alone with a strange man in the middle of nowhere, completely at his mercy. Every instinct that had kept her alive for the past 8 months was screaming at her to be cautious, to be ready to run. But she was so tired of running. Frank seemed to sense her unease. He stepped back, giving her space, and kept his voice casual as he spoke. "Let me get Buck settled in the barn, then I will show you inside and get some food started. There is a pump around the side of the house if you want to wash up. Water is cold but clean." "Thank you," Josie managed. She found the pump where he had indicated and worked the handle until water gushed forth. She drank deeply first, the cold water soothing her parched throat, then splashed her face and hands, watching the dirt and dried blood swirl away. When she looked up, she saw Frank emerging from the barn. He walked past her to the cabin door and pushed it open, lighting a lantern just inside. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly neat. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rough wooden table and chairs in front of it. There was a small cook stove in one corner, shelves lined with supplies and cooking implements, and 2 doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. Everything was clean and organized, not what she had expected from a bachelor cowboy. Frank saw her looking around, and the corner of his mouth quirked up slightly. "I know how to take care of a place. My mother taught me that much. A man who lives in squalor becomes squalor." He moved to the cookstove and began building a fire. "The room on the left is mine. The one on the right is yours while you are here. There is a bed and a washstand and not much else, but it is private and the door has a lock on the inside." That last detail did more to ease Josie's anxiety than anything else could have. Frank was telling her, without making it awkward, that he understood her fear and was taking steps to address it. She moved to the indicated door and pushed it open. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a simple quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a small trunk at the foot of the bed. A window looked out over the dark prairie. "Thank you," she said again, because she could not seem to find any other words adequate to the situation. "Come out when you are ready and we will get some food in you," Frank said, already pulling supplies from the shelves. "Nothing fancy tonight. Just beans and cornbread and some bacon. Tomorrow I will make something better." Josie went into the room and closed the door, hearing the quiet snick of the lock as she turned it. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally let herself break down, silent tears streaming down her face as the events of the day caught up with her. She had been so close to disaster, so close to ending up beaten and broken like Frank's mother. But instead, she was here, safe for the moment, because a stranger had chosen to help rather than look away. After several minutes, she pulled herself together and wiped her face. She could smell food cooking, and her stomach reminded her that she had not eaten since the previous evening. She unlocked the door and emerged to find Frank setting plates on the table. He glanced at her, took in her red-rimmed eyes, and said nothing about them. They ate in comfortable silence. The food was simple but good, and Josie was so hungry she had to force herself to eat slowly. Frank kept her cup filled with water and passed her the cornbread when her piece was gone. The dogs had settled on a rug near the fireplace, and the only sounds were the quiet crackling of the fire and the occasional clink of utensils against plates. When the meal was finished, Frank poured them both coffee and they sat at the table nursing their cups. Outside, darkness had fully fallen, and through the window Josie could see more stars than she had ever seen in her life, undimmed by town lights. "I need to ask you something," Frank said finally, his tone serious. "And I need you to answer honestly. Is anyone going to come looking for you? Not those men from town, but your father or the man he wanted you to marry. Are they actively searching?" Josie considered the question carefully. "I do not think so. Like I said, I think my father was more concerned with his reputation than with actually finding me. And the man he wanted me to marry, he had plenty of other options. I was convenient, nothing more. Young and biddable, or so my father promised him." She took a sip of her coffee. "But I cannot be certain. I have been careful about using my full name. Most places I have just gone by Josie and not given a surname. Today was the first time in months I used my real name, and that was only because Marcus Hendricks insisted on knowing it for his records." Frank nodded slowly. "Well, Hendricks does not seem like the type to go spreading information around, especially not information that might bring a marshal asking questions about his behavior. You should be safe enough here. This land is registered under my name, and most folks in Enid do not even know I exist. I go into town maybe once a month for supplies, and I keep to myself otherwise. You must get lonely," Josie said without thinking, then felt her face flush. "I am sorry. That was too personal. No, it is a fair observation." Frank stared into his coffee cup as if it held answers. "I do get lonely sometimes, but I got used to my own company over the years. After my mother died, my father tried to force us to come back to his place. My sister was only 11, and I knew what would happen if we did, so I took her and ran. We lived rough for about 3 years, me taking whatever work I could find, until I was old enough that people stopped asking questions about why we were alone. Finally got her to San Antonio and made sure she was settled with a good family before I moved on. How old were you when your mother died? 14, like I said. My sister and I were on our own from the time I was 14 until I was 17. Those were hard years. He looked up at her, and in the lamplight his eyes seemed darker, shadowed with old memories. But they taught me to rely on myself, to trust my judgment. When the government announced the land run, I knew it was my chance to finally put down roots somewhere. So I came to Oklahoma and I rode hard and I found this piece of land with good grass and water nearby, and I claimed it. Everything I have got, I built with my own hands. There was pride in his voice, and Josie could understand why. In a world where so much was determined by birth and connections and luck, Frank had carved out a space for himself through sheer determination. She felt a kinship with him, both of them running from painful pasts and trying to build something better. "What will you do?" Frank asked after a moment. "I meant what I said about you staying as long as you need, but eventually you are going to have to make a decision about your future." "I do not know," Josie admitted. "I had planned to claim land in the run to build my own homestead. I thought if I had my own place, I could finally stop running. I could make a life for myself on my terms. But without that stake money, I have nothing. No claim, no way to start over. I have been working just to survive, and it feels like I will be stuck doing that forever." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the side of his coffee cup. When he spoke, he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "There is still unclaimed land out here. Not as good as what was grabbed in the run, but workable. If you wanted to file a claim, you could. The problem is proving it up. You have got to build a structure, cultivate some of the land, live on it for 5 years before you get the deed. That is hard work even for someone with resources. For a woman alone, it would be nearly impossible." "I know," Josie said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Believe me, I know. Everything is set up to keep women dependent on men. We cannot own property in most places, cannot vote, cannot do anything without some man's permission. And if we try to make our own way, we are called unnatural or scandalous or worse. The Oklahoma Territory is different from most places," Frank said. "Women can own land here. They can file claims just like men. The problem is not the law, it is the practical reality of surviving out here alone." He paused, then continued, "But you would not have to be alone." Josie looked at him sharply, her defenses immediately rising. "If you think I am going to repay your kindness by becoming your woman, you are mistaken. I would rather take my chances on the prairie." "That is not what I meant," Frank said quickly, holding up his hands. "Not like that. What I mean is you could file a claim on the land adjacent to mine. It is still available. I checked last time I was at the land office. We could help each other out. I could assist with the heavy work. You could help with things around here. We would be neighbors, not—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Josie studied his face, trying to determine if this was some kind of trick. But Frank met her gaze steadily, and she saw only sincerity there. "Why would you do that? What would you get out of it? Honestly, I could use the help. Running this place alone is harder than I expected. There are only so many hours in a day and I am constantly behind on something. And like you said, I get lonely. It would be nice to have someone nearby to talk to share a meal with sometimes. But more than that." He hesitated, then forged ahead. "I meant what I said earlier about not being the kind of man who looks away. You need a chance, a real chance to build a life for yourself. I am in a position to help with that, so I am offering." Josie felt tears threatening again and blinked them back angrily. She was tired of crying, tired of feeling weak and desperate, but Frank's offer was more than just charity. He was offering her exactly what she had wanted from the beginning, a piece of land and a chance to prove herself. It was more than she had dared to hope for. "I would pay you back," she said firmly. "However long it takes, I would pay you back for whatever help you give me." "I am not asking you to pay me back. I am suggesting a partnership of sorts. You help me, I help you. We both benefit. But people will talk. A single woman living alone right next to a single man. They will assume things." Frank shrugged. "Let them assume. The closest neighbors are 6 miles away, and like I said, I do not go into town much. As long as we know the truth, what does it matter what strangers think?" It was a compelling argument, and Josie found herself wanting to believe it could work. But she had learned to be cautious, to look for the catch. What if you meet someone? What if you want to get married? Your wife would not be happy about me living next door. "I will deal with that if it happens," Frank said, "but I am not looking for a wife. I have got my hands full with the ranch." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Josie said, "I need time to think about this. It is a generous offer, but it is also a big decision. I do not want to make it while I am still rattled from today." "Of course. Take all the time you need." Frank drained his coffee cup and stood up, collecting their dishes. "You must be exhausted. Go on to bed and we will talk more tomorrow." Josie helped him clean up despite his protests, then retreated to her small room. She locked the door again and lay down on the bed without bothering to undress. Her mind was racing, going over everything that had happened since that morning. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had been serving drinks in that saloon, trying to avoid Marcus Hendricks's wandering hands. Now she was lying in a strange bed in a cabin on the prairie, contemplating a future she had never expected. Through the thin walls, she could hear Frank moving around in the main room, banking the fire and preparing for bed. The sounds were somehow comforting, a reminder that she was not alone in the darkness. Despite all her lingering caution, she found herself trusting him. He had proven himself already, not just in standing up to those men, but in the small ways he had tried to make her feel safe and respected. She must have fallen asleep because the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the small window and she could smell coffee brewing. Josie sat up, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where she was. Her body ached from the previous day's exertions, and her lip was swollen where it had been split. But she was alive and safe, which was more than she had expected when she had fled the saloon. She made use of the washstand, tidying herself as best she could, then emerged from the room. Frank was at the stove frying eggs and bacon. He looked up when she entered and nodded a greeting. "Morning, I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Josie admitted. "Thank you again for everything. Sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." They ate together, and Josie noticed that Frank seemed more relaxed this morning, the wariness from the previous evening gone. He told her about his plans for the day, which involved checking on his cattle and fixing a section of fence that had blown down in a recent storm. Josie found herself volunteering to help, and Frank accepted without hesitation. After breakfast, they walked out to the corral where Frank kept his horses. In addition to Buck, the bay he had been riding yesterday, there were 2 mares and a young gelding. Frank saddled Buck and one of the mares, a sweet-tempered sorrel named Daisy, and showed Josie how to adjust the stirrups for her shorter legs. They rode out across Frank's land, and he pointed out the boundaries of his claim. It was good land, with plenty of grass and a creek that ran along the eastern edge. His cattle were scattered across the range, brown and white shapes against the green grass. Frank checked each group, counting heads and looking for signs of illness or injury. Josie watched him work, impressed by his competence and the gentle way he handled the animals. He clearly loved this life, despite its hardships. There was a peace about him out here that she had not noticed the previous day, as if the prairie itself restored something in him. When they reached the northern boundary of his land, Frank reined in and pointed ahead. "That is the parcel I was talking about. 80 acres, same as mine. It runs from here north to that line of trees you can see in the distance, and from the creek east to that rocky outcrop. Not as much water as my place, but the creek is close enough that you could dig a well without too much trouble." Josie looked at the land, trying to imagine building a life here. It seemed impossibly big and empty, but also full of possibility. No one could tell her what to do here. No one could force her into anything she did not want. It would be hers, truly hers. "The land office in Enid can handle the filing," Frank continued. "It costs $14 to register a claim. Then you have got 6 months to build a structure, another 6 months after that to start cultivation. As long as you are making progress and living on the land, the government will not bother you. After 5 years, you pay another $6 and it is yours free and clear." $14, Josie repeated. It might as well have been $1,400 for all the ability she had to pay it. "I have nothing, not a single cent." "I will front you the money," Frank said immediately. "And before you argue, remember this is a partnership. I am investing in having a reliable neighbor who can help me when I need it. It is worth $14 to me to make that happen." Josie wanted to argue, to insist she could not take his money, but the words died in her throat. This was her chance, possibly her only chance. Pride was a luxury she could not afford. "I will pay you back," she said instead. "Every penny with interest if you want it. No interest, just your help when I need it and your company when I am tired of talking to the cows." Despite herself, Josie smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had managed in longer than she could remember. "That seems like a fair trade." They spent the rest of the day working on Frank's fence, and Josie insisted on doing her share despite never having done such work before. Frank showed her how to string the wire and secure the posts, patient with her mistakes and quick to praise when she got something right. By the end of the day, her hands were blistered and her back ached, but she felt a sense of accomplishment that was entirely new. Over the following days, they fell into a routine. Josie helped Frank with the daily work of running the ranch, learning skills she had never imagined needing. Frank was a good teacher, showing her how to milk a cow, how to mend tack, how to read the signs of changing weather. In the evenings, they would sit at the table after dinner and talk, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for their futures. Josie learned that Frank had a quiet sense of humor that caught her off guard, making her laugh when she least expected it. She learned that he loved to read, a passion his mother had instilled in him, and that he had a small collection of books he had accumulated over the years. She learned that he was deeply fair-minded, that he thought through problems carefully before acting, and that once he gave his word on something he never went back on it. Frank learned that Josie was stronger than she looked, with a stubborn determination that matched his own. He learned that she had been educated at a finishing school, unusual for someone from her background, because her mother had insisted on it before she died. He learned that Josie loved the early morning hours, when the world was still quiet and full of possibility, and that she had a beautiful singing voice that she only shared when she thought no one was listening. 2 weeks after Josie had arrived, Frank announced that he needed to go into Enid for supplies. "I think it would be a good idea for you to come along," he said. "We can stop at the land office and file your claim. No point waiting when we know what we want to do." Josie felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of returning to town, but she agreed. They set out early, before the heat of the day, riding together companionably. As they approached Enid, Josie felt her anxiety building. What if Marcus Hendricks saw her? What if those men decided to cause trouble, but Frank seemed unconcerned? "If anyone bothers you, they will have to go through me first, and I do not think they want to do that." The land office was a small building near the center of town, and Josie was relieved to see that it was far from the saloon where she had worked. Inside, a balding man with spectacles looked up from his paperwork and nodded at Frank. "Frank Wakefield. Been a while since I saw you." "What can I do for you?" "Morning, Samuel. I would like to register a claim for Miss Lawrence here, the 80 acres directly north of my place." Samuel pulled out a large map and consulted it. "That parcel is still available. You sure you want to claim it, miss? It is pretty isolated out there." "I am sure," Josie said firmly. "All right then. I will need your full name, your age, and your signature, and the $14 filing fee." Josie provided the information while Frank counted out the money. Samuel wrote everything down carefully, then had Josie sign the register. He gave her a stamped document that declared her claim official. "Remember, you have got 6 months to build a habitable structure and another 6 months to start cultivation. You have got to live on the land at least part of the time to prove your claim. Any questions?" "No, sir. Thank you." As they left the land office, Josie clutched the document to her chest. She owned land. For the first time in her life, she owned something that was truly hers. The feeling was indescribable. Frank took her to the general store next, where he bought supplies and tools. Josie noticed that he added several items that were clearly meant for building, lumber and nails and such, but she said nothing. At the mercantile, Frank bought her fabric for a new dress and some basic personal items, waving away her protests. "You cannot keep wearing that same torn dress," he said practically. "Consider it an advance on your wages as my ranch hand." They were loading the wagon Frank had brought for supplies when a woman's voice called out, "Franklin Wakefield, is that you?" Frank turned and smiled, a genuine expression of pleasure crossing his face. "Mrs. Peterson, how have you been?" An older woman with kind eyes and silver hair approached, accompanied by a younger woman who looked to be in her mid-20s. "I have been well, dear. And who is this young lady?" "This is Josephine Lawrence. She just filed a claim on the land north of mine. Josie, this is Martha Peterson and her daughter Clara. They run a ranch about 6 miles west of my place." "It is a pleasure to meet you," Josie said, trying not to squirm under their appraising gazes. "A woman claiming land," Martha said, her eyes lighting up. "Good for you. We need more women out here who are not afraid of hard work." She glanced at Frank. "And it is good that Franklin has a neighbor now. I have been worried about him out there all alone." "Mother," Clara said, her tone suggesting this was an old argument. Martha ignored her. "You must come to dinner soon, both of you. We see so few people out here, and I do love having an excuse to cook something special. How about Sunday after next?" Frank looked at Josie, who nodded. "We would be happy to come," he said. They chatted for a few more minutes before parting ways. As they drove the wagon out of town, Josie said, "They seemed nice. They are good people. Martha's husband died about a year ago, and she and Clara have been running the ranch themselves since then. They are doing a fine job of it, too. Clara is one of the best horse trainers in the territory." "Does Clara have a husband?" "No. She was engaged once, but he was killed in a riding accident before they could marry. That was several years ago. She has not shown any interest in anyone since, from what I hear." Josie thought about that, about the many ways lives could be derailed by loss and circumstance. At least she had chosen her path, difficult as it was. Some people had their choices made for them by fate. When they returned to Frank's place, they unloaded the wagon and Frank immediately began sorting through the building materials. "I figure we can start on your cabin next week," he said. "It does not have to be fancy, but it needs to be solid enough to pass inspection. One room should be enough to start, maybe 12 by 12. We can add on later if you want." "I cannot ask you to build my cabin for me," Josie protested. "That is too much. You are not asking, I am offering. And it is not just for you. Like I said, having a reliable neighbor benefits me too. Besides, I need to stay sharp on my building skills. This will be good practice." Over the next 3 weeks, they worked on the cabin whenever they could spare time from the daily ranch chores. Frank showed Josie how to notch logs and fit them together, how to make a roof that would not leak, how to build a fireplace that would draw properly. Josie threw herself into the work, determined to contribute as much as she could. She also began learning more about the land itself. Frank taught her to identify different grasses and which ones were best for grazing. He showed her how to read animal tracks, how to predict weather from the behavior of birds and insects. He taught her to shoot, spending patient hours helping her overcome her fear of the gun's recoil until she could hit what she aimed at more often than not. In turn, Josie began teaching Frank things he had never learned. She showed him how to cook dishes more elaborate than his usual bachelor fare. She organized his chaotic system of record keeping, setting up a simple ledger to track expenses and income. She mended his clothes properly, not just the rough stitching he had been doing himself. They became partners in the truest sense, each contributing what they knew and learning from the other. And somewhere along the way, without either of them quite noticing when it happened, they became friends. The cabin was finished 2 days before they were due to visit the Petersons for dinner. It was small but sturdy, with a good stone fireplace, a wooden floor, and shutters that could be closed against storms. Frank had even built her a simple bed frame and table from leftover lumber. Josie stood in the doorway of her new home, looking around at the space that was entirely hers, and felt emotions swelling in her chest that she could not quite name. Frank stood beside her, clearly pleased with their work. "It is perfect," she whispered. "It is a start," Frank corrected gently. "You can make it whatever you want it to be." That night, Josie moved into her cabin. Frank had insisted she take some of his spare dishes and blankets and other household items, loans until she could acquire her own. She lit her first fire in her own fireplace and sat at her own table in her own house, and cried tears of relief and joy and gratitude. The next day, she began working on cultivating a small garden plot near the cabin. Frank brought her seeds he had been saving and showed her how to prepare the soil. They also discussed what she should do about acquiring cattle of her own, since proving up the land would require showing some agricultural use. "I have got a cow that is due to calve in a few weeks," Frank said. "When the calf is weaned, you can have it. That will give you a start on your herd, and I will help you build a small corral near your cabin. Frank, you have already done so much, and I will keep doing it until you are established. That is the deal." On Sunday, they rode to the Peterson ranch together. Josie had made a new dress from the fabric Frank had bought her, a simple but respectable blue calico that fit much better than her old torn garment. She had managed to do something with her hair as well, pinning it up in a way that looked almost elegant. Frank had cleaned up too, shaving and putting on a shirt that was only slightly faded. As they rode, Josie noticed him glancing at her sidelong, and she wondered what he was thinking. Over the past weeks, she had grown comfortable with him in a way she had never been comfortable with anyone. But lately, she had begun noticing things about him that had nothing to do with his helpfulness or his character. The way his hands moved when he worked, strong and sure. The sound of his laugh when something genuinely amused him. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She told herself firmly that such thoughts were inappropriate and dangerous. Frank was her neighbor and friend, nothing more. Allowing herself to think of him any other way would only complicate things, and potentially ruin the arrangement they had built. The Peterson ranch was larger and more established than Frank's, with a substantial house and several outbuildings. Martha greeted them warmly and ushered them inside, where a large dining table was laden with food. Clara was there as well, along with 2 ranch hands who helped run the place. Dinner was a lively affair, with everyone talking over each other and laughing. Josie found herself relaxing in a way she had not relaxed in company since leaving home. Martha asked thoughtful questions about her plans for her land, offering advice without being condescending. Clara talked enthusiastically about a new horse she was training, and even got Frank to admit he had a mare he needed help with. After dinner, Martha shooed everyone out to the porch while she and Clara cleaned up, despite Josie's offers to help. Josie sat on the porch steps, watching the sun set over the prairie, and felt a sense of contentment she had not known was possible. Frank sat beside her and they were quiet together for a while. Finally, he said, "You seem happy." "I am," Josie said, surprised to realize it was true. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I am actually happy. I have my own place. I am building something that matters. I have good neighbors." She glanced at him. "I have a friend." Frank smiled, and there was something in his expression that made Josie's heart skip. "I am happy too," he said quietly. "I did not realize how much I missed having someone to talk to until you showed up. This past month it has been good. Really good." Before Josie could respond, Martha called them back inside for dessert. The moment passed, but Josie could not quite shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, some unspoken understanding that was both thrilling and terrifying. As summer turned toward fall, Josie threw herself into improving her homestead. She finished her garden and was rewarded with a modest crop of vegetables. Frank helped her build a corral and a small lean-to shelter for the calf he had promised her. She named the calf Buttercup, despite Frank's teasing that it was too frivolous a name for livestock. She also began exploring her land more thoroughly, walking the boundaries and learning its features. There was a small rise on the northern edge that offered a beautiful view of the surrounding prairie. She found a patch of wild plum trees near the creek and made jam from the fruit. She discovered a spot where someone, probably long ago, had tried to dig a well and abandoned it. Frank helped her finish the job, and she had her own water source. The work was hard, harder than anything she had done in her life. But it was also deeply satisfying in a way her previous work had never been. Every improvement she made to her land, every skill she learned, was an investment in herself and her future. No one could take this away from her as long as she continued to prove her claim. She and Frank continued to help each other regularly. Some days she would work on his ranch, helping with the cattle or assisting with whatever project he had going. Other days he would work on her land, helping with tasks that required more strength or expertise than she possessed yet. They fell into an easy rhythm, anticipating each other's needs and working together with increasing efficiency. They also spent most evenings together, alternating between his cabin and hers. They would share dinner, and then sit talking long into the night, or reading aloud from Frank's books, or simply enjoying the quiet companionship. Josie had never had a friendship like this, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than social obligation or family ties. But as the weeks passed, Josie became increasingly aware that her feelings for Frank were evolving beyond friendship. She found herself thinking about him constantly when they were apart. She noticed small details about him: the scar on his left hand from a long-ago accident, the way he always gave his horse a pat on the neck before dismounting, the gentle tone he used when talking to animals. She caught herself watching him when he worked, admiring the play of muscles beneath his shirt as he swung an axe or lifted heavy loads. She noticed the way his presence made her feel safe and valued. And sometimes, when their hands would brush accidentally, or he would stand close to her to demonstrate something, she would feel a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the weather. It was dangerous, she knew. She had sworn to herself that she would never depend on a man again, that she would build a life on her own terms. Falling in love with Frank would complicate everything, would make her vulnerable in ways she had vowed never to be vulnerable again. But knowing something was dangerous did not make it any less appealing. One evening in late September, they were sitting on the steps of Josie's cabin, watching the stars emerge. The air had cooled with the approaching fall, and Josie had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Frank sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I was thinking," Frank said slowly, "about winter. It is going to be here before we know it, and your cabin is not insulated as well as mine. Plus, you will be alone out here if we get a bad storm." "I will manage," Josie said, trying to keep the defensive note out of her voice. "I am not going to run back to your place every time things get difficult. I am not suggesting you should. I am suggesting we need to prepare better. Maybe add some insulation to your walls. Make sure you have plenty of firewood laid in. I can show you how to preserve more food for the winter months." "Oh," Josie felt foolish for jumping to conclusions. "Yes, that would be helpful, thank you." They were quiet for a moment, then Frank continued, "But I do worry about you being alone out here. Not because I think you cannot handle it, but because this country can be unforgiving. If something happened, if you got hurt or sick, it could be serious before anyone knew." "What are you suggesting?" "I am not sure exactly. Just that we should have a plan. Maybe we should check on each other every morning, make sure the other is all right. If one of us does not show up, the other knows to investigate." It was a reasonable suggestion, but something in Frank's tone made Josie think he was dancing around something else. "Frank, what are you not saying?" He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I am saying that the thought of something happening to you and me not knowing, not being able to help, it terrifies me. And I know that is probably not appropriate given our arrangement, but it is the truth." Josie's heart began to pound. "Why would that be inappropriate?" "Because we are supposed to be business partners, neighbors helping each other out. I am not supposed to be lying awake at night worrying about you. I am not supposed to be thinking about you constantly during the day. I am not supposed to feel like my heart stops every time I see you walk up the path to my place." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Josie could not breathe, could not think. Frank kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he could not bear to look at her. "Frank," she said softly. "I am sorry," he said quickly. "I should not have said anything. Forget I mentioned it. We can just go back to how things were." "No," Josie said, and now she did turn to look at him. "We cannot go back, not now." Frank finally met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw hope and fear warring with each other. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that you are not alone in how you feel. I am saying that I think about you constantly too. I am saying that being near you makes me happy in a way nothing else does." She took a shaky breath. "I am saying that I think I am falling in love with you, and I do not know what to do about it." The look of joy that crossed Frank's face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "Josie," he breathed and reached for her hand. His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and strong. "I have been falling in love with you since the day I met you. Maybe since the moment you asked me for help, and I saw the courage it took for you to trust a stranger. I was terrified of you at first, Josie admitted. Terrified of what you might want from me. But you never asked for anything except my company and my help with the work. You treated me like an equal, like a person with value beyond what I could provide for you. No one has ever done that before. Then no one has ever truly seen you, Frank said. He raised their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender it brought tears to Josie's eyes. You are the strongest person I know. The way you have taken everything that happened to you and turned it into something positive, the way you have worked to build a life here, it amazes me. You amaze me. Josie felt like her heart might burst. What do we do now? I do not know, Frank admitted. I have never felt like this before. But I know I want to be with you. I know I want to see where this goes, and I know I will do whatever it takes to make you happy and keep you safe. I do not want you to take care of me, Josie said, needing him to understand. I do not want to be a burden or an obligation. I want to be your partner in every sense. You are, Frank assured her. You always have been. Josie, I am not asking you to give up your independence or your land or any of the things you have worked for. I am just asking if I can be part of your life in a deeper way than I have been. Yes, Josie whispered. Yes, I want that too. Frank cupped her face gently in his free hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. Can I kiss you? Instead of answering, Josie leaned forward and closed the distance between them. The kiss was soft and sweet, tentative at first as they learned each other. Then Frank's arm came around her waist, pulling her closer, and Josie's hands found their way to his shoulders. The kiss deepened, and Josie felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Frank rested his forehead against hers, a smile playing at his lips. I have wanted to do that for weeks. So have I, Josie confessed. I kept telling myself it was a terrible idea. It probably is, Frank agreed. But I do not care. They sat together on the steps for a long time, holding each other, talking quietly about their feelings and their hopes. The stars wheeled overhead and the prairie night sounds surrounded them, and Josie felt more at peace than she had in her entire life. Eventually, Frank reluctantly said he should head back to his own cabin. It is late and we both have work tomorrow, but can I see you at breakfast? I will cook. Only if you let me help, Josie countered. We are partners, remember. Partners, Frank agreed, and kissed her again before heading into the darkness. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened. They were careful to maintain propriety, aware that rumors could harm both their reputations, but they spent every possible moment together. Frank would hold her hand as they walked the boundaries of their combined land. Josie would lean against him when they sat together in the evenings. They kissed often, sweet stolen moments that left them both wanting more but also content with what they had. Martha Peterson noticed the change immediately when they visited for Sunday dinner again in early October. She took one look at them together and smiled knowingly, but said nothing. Clara was more direct. It is about time you two figured it out, she said with a grin. Mother and I had a bet on how long it would take. She won. We were not exactly subtle, were we? Frank said, laughing. Not even a little bit, Martha confirmed. The way you two looked at each other during dinner last time, I was surprised there were not sparks flying across the table. Despite the teasing, there was genuine warmth in their words. After dinner, Martha pulled Josie aside. I am happy for you, dear. Frank is a good man, one of the best I have known, and you are good for him. I have watched him since he arrived in the territory, always holding himself apart from others, always working so hard to prove something. Since you came along, he seems lighter somehow, more content. He makes me happy too, Josie said. Happier than I ever thought possible. Then hold on to that, Martha advised. Life out here is hard enough without facing it alone. When you find someone who makes it easier, who makes the good days better and the hard days bearable, you do not let go. As October turned into November, the weather began to change. The days were shorter and cooler, and the grass began to brown. Frank and Josie worked together to prepare for winter, gathering firewood, preserving food, making sure both cabins were as weatherproof as possible. They also began talking about the future in more concrete terms. One evening, as they sat in Frank's cabin with the fire crackling merrily, Frank said, "I have been thinking about something and I want your honest opinion." "Of course," Josie said, looking up from the shirt she was mending. "What if we combined our claims?" "Not officially, not legally, but in practice. We could work the land together, build up a larger herd, make both our places more secure. We are already doing that to some extent, but I am talking about making it a permanent partnership." "Like a business partnership?" Josie asked carefully. "Like a marriage," Frank said bluntly. "I am not asking yet, not formally, but I am putting it out there as something to think about. Because I know where my heart is, Josie. It is with you. And if you will have me, I would like to spend the rest of my life working this land with you, building a future with you." Josie set down her mending, her hands trembling slightly. "I have been thinking about it too," she admitted. "But I am scared. My father chose the wrong man for me once. What if I am making another mistake?" "I am not asking you to trust me blindly," Frank said. "You have seen who I am over these past months. You have seen me at my best and my worst. You know my habits, my temperament, my history. I am not presenting you with a false front. This is who I am, for better or worse." "I know," Josie said, "and that is exactly why I want to say yes. But getting married means giving up my land claim, does it not? Once I am your wife, the law will say you own everything." Frank was quiet for a moment, then said, "That is a fair concern, and I have been thinking about it too. What if we did not register the marriage officially? We could have a ceremony, speak vows in front of witnesses, live as husband and wife in every way that matters. But on paper, you would remain unmarried and your claim would stay in your name. That way, if anything happens to me, you do not lose everything you have built." "That is not legal," Josie pointed out. "No, but it is practical, and more importantly, it protects you. I do not want you to ever be in a position where you are dependent on me or anyone else. I want you to have the security of knowing your land is yours, no matter what." Josie felt tears prickling her eyes. "You would do that for me?" "Give up the legal protections that come with marriage just to make sure I am secure?" "In a heartbeat," Frank said simply. "Josie, I do not want to own you. I do not want legal power over you. I just want to be with you, to build a life with you. Everything else is secondary." "Then yes," Josie said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you. Legally or not, publicly or privately, I do not care. I want to be your wife." Frank crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left them both breathless. When they finally broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "When?" Frank asked. "Soon," Josie said. "Before winter really sets in. I want to start our life together as soon as possible." They decided to ask Martha and Clara Peterson to stand as witnesses, along with Martha's 2 ranch hands. The ceremony would be held at the Peterson Ranch in 2 weeks, giving them time to prepare. Frank rode into Enid and spoke with the traveling preacher who came through the territory periodically, arranging for him to be present on the agreed-upon date. Those 2 weeks flew by in a blur of activity. Josie made herself a new dress, a beautiful deep green that brought out her eyes. Frank traded some of his cattle for a simple gold ring from a jeweler in Enid. They worked on both cabins. Frank's larger one becoming their primary home while Josie's served as a spare room and workroom. The night before the wedding, Josie stayed in her cabin alone for the last time. She lay in her bed looking at the ceiling she and Frank had built together, thinking about how much her life had changed in just 6 months. She had come to Oklahoma running from her past, terrified and desperate. Now she was about to marry a man she loved, a man who saw her as an equal and partner. She thought about her father and the life he had tried to force on her. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if he regretted his actions, or if he simply wrote her off as a disappointment. Part of her wanted him to know that she had not just survived but thrived, that she had built something meaningful with her life. But another part did not care what he thought anymore. His opinion no longer had power over her. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the first frost of the season glittering on the grass. Frank and Josie rode to the Peterson ranch together, their hands linked between their horses. Martha had decorated her parlor with late-season wildflowers, and Clara had baked a cake, despite Josie's protests that it was not necessary. The preacher was a kind-faced man in his 50s who asked them a few questions about their intentions, and then declared himself satisfied. The ceremony itself was simple, traditional vows spoken before their small group of witnesses. When Frank slipped the ring onto Josie's finger, his hand was steady even though his eyes were bright with emotion. "I promise to love you, respect you, and stand beside you for all the days of my life," he said. "You are my partner, my equal, and the best thing that ever happened to me." Josie's voice shook as she spoke her own vows. "I promise to love you with all my heart, to work beside you, to support you through whatever comes. You gave me back my life when I had lost hope, and I will spend the rest of my days grateful for that gift. Then by the power vested in me, I declare you husband and wife in the sight of God and these witnesses," the preacher said. "You may kiss your bride." Frank did, thoroughly and enthusiastically, to the applause and laughter of their friends. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling through happy tears. The celebration that followed was joyful and relaxed. Martha served a wonderful dinner, and Clara proposed a toast to the newlyweds. The ranch hands contributed a bottle of whiskey they had been saving for a special occasion. As the afternoon turned to evening, they all sat around the fire telling stories and singing songs. Finally, as full darkness fell, Frank and Josie said their goodbyes and headed home. They rode through the cold night under a canopy of stars, and Josie had never felt more alive or more certain of her choices. When they reached Frank's cabin, he dismounted first and then helped her down, catching her in his arms and holding her close. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wakefield," he said softly. "I am still Josephine Lawrence on paper," Josie reminded him with a smile. "But in your heart, in our hearts I am yours," Josie said, "and you are mine." Frank carried her over the threshold, and they spent their wedding night discovering each other in the warmth of the cabin they would share. Outside, the prairie wind sang its ancient song, and inside, two people who had both been running from their pasts finally found a future worth running toward. Winter came on hard that year, with several significant snowstorms and long stretches of bitter cold. But Frank and Josie weathered it together, keeping each other warm and entertained through the long, dark months. They played cards and read books and talked endlessly, learning every detail of each other's lives and hearts. When the weather allowed, they would bundle up and check on the cattle and horses, making sure all the animals were surviving the harsh conditions. Josie proved herself invaluable during these checks, spotting problems Frank might have missed and working tirelessly to address them. In March, as winter finally began to release its grip, Josie realized she was pregnant. She broke the news to Frank over breakfast one morning, watching nervously for his reaction. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, wonder, and finally pure joy, before he swept her up in his arms and spun her around. "Are you sure? Are you certain?" he kept asking. "As certain as I can be at this point," Josie laughed. "The baby should come in October or November." "We are going to be parents," Frank said wonderingly. "We are going to have a family." Over the following months, Frank was almost comically protective of Josie. He tried to prevent her from doing any heavy work, which led to several arguments about her capability and independence. Eventually, they reached a compromise where Josie continued to work, but agreed to let Frank handle the most strenuous tasks. As Josie's pregnancy progressed, they began preparing for the baby's arrival. Frank built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until there was not a single rough edge. Josie sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric, marveling at how small they were. They spent evenings discussing names and making plans for the future. Martha and Clara visited regularly, bringing gifts and advice. Martha had raised 5 children, all now grown and scattered, and she was delighted to share her wisdom. Clara surprised everyone by knitting a beautiful baby blanket, revealing a domestic skill no one knew she possessed. In late October, as the leaves on the cottonwood trees turned gold, Josie went into labor. Frank rode for Martha and Clara while one of their ranch hands stayed with Josie. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Frank was certain he would lose either Josie or the baby or both. He paced outside the bedroom door, praying harder than he had ever prayed in his life. Finally, as dawn broke over the prairie, he heard a baby's cry. Martha emerged from the bedroom, tired but smiling. "You have a son," she said, "and Josie is fine. She is exhausted but fine. Go meet your boy." Frank entered the bedroom to find Josie propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat but her face radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in Clara's blanket. Frank approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at his son. The baby was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. As Frank watched, the baby opened his eyes, revealing the same blue-green color as Frank's own. Something deep in Frank's chest cracked open, a reservoir of love he had not known existed. "Hello, little one," he whispered, and reached out to touch one tiny hand. The baby's fingers immediately wrapped around his much larger finger, gripping with surprising strength. "Welcome to the world. What should we name him?" Josie asked softly. They had discussed many options but never settled on one definitively. Now, looking at his son, Frank said, "What about Samuel? After the man at the land office who helped you file your claim. Without him, none of this would have happened." Josie smiled. "Samuel Wakefield, I like it." "Samuel Franklin Wakefield," Frank corrected. "He should have a family name." "Then Samuel Franklin Lawrence Wakefield," Josie said. "Because he comes from both of us, and both our names deserve to be represented." Frank kissed her forehead. "Perfect. He is perfect, and you are perfect, and I am the luckiest man alive." The first year of Samuel's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and countless small miracles. Frank and Josie adjusted to parenthood, learning as they went and supporting each other through the challenges. The ranch work continued, made more complicated by the addition of a baby, but they managed through careful planning and the occasional help from the Petersons. Samuel grew quickly, transforming from a tiny newborn into a sturdy toddler who loved nothing more than following his father around the ranch. By his second birthday, he was riding in front of Frank on Buck, squealing with delight as they checked on the cattle. He adored animals and showed an early affinity for horses that suggested he would be a natural horseman. As Samuel grew, so did the ranch. Frank and Josie's hard work was paying off, and they were able to expand their herd and make improvements to their property. They built an addition onto the cabin, adding a bedroom for Samuel and a larger kitchen for Josie. They constructed a proper barn to replace the lean-to they had been using. They even hired a ranch hand to help with the daily work, a young man named Thomas who proved reliable and hardworking. Josie proved up her claim after 5 years, officially receiving the deed to her 80 acres. They held a celebration at the Peterson Ranch, inviting all their neighbors from miles around. It was a reminder of how far she had come, from the desperate woman fleeing a saloon to a successful landowner and rancher in her own right. When Samuel was 4, Josie became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the spring of 1895, they welcomed a daughter. They named her Rose Martha Lawrence Wakefield, after the wildflowers Josie loved and the woman who had been such a good friend to them. Rose was a sunny baby with her mother's dark hair and her father's eyes, and Samuel adored her immediately. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful in the region. Frank's reputation as an honest dealer and skilled horseman spread, and people came from far and wide to buy his stock. Josie managed the business side of things, keeping meticulous records and making shrewd decisions about when to buy and sell. They added to their family twice more over the next several years. A son they named James came when Samuel was 7 and Rose was 3. Then, when Josie was 35 and convinced they were done having children, she surprised them both by becoming pregnant one more time. Their youngest daughter, whom they named Hope, arrived just before the turn of the century. The children grew up strong and capable, each inheriting different traits from their parents. Samuel was serious and responsible like his father, with a gift for working with animals. Rose was fierce and independent like her mother, determined to do everything her older brother could do and more. James was the dreamer of the family, always reading or exploring or asking questions about how things worked. And Hope, the baby, was the sunshine of the household, laughing easily and making everyone around her happy. Through it all, Frank and Josie's love for each other only deepened. They faced challenges together, bad weather and cattle disease and the countless small crises that came with ranching and raising children. But they also celebrated victories together, good seasons and healthy calves, and the milestones of their children's lives. They never did register their marriage officially. Josie kept her land in her name and her independence intact, but everyone for miles around knew they were as married as any couple could be. Their partnership was legendary. The way they worked together and supported each other and built something lasting out of nothing but determination and love. On their 20th anniversary, they stood together on the rise at the northern edge of Josie's original claim, the spot where she had once imagined her future. Now that future had become reality, more wonderful than she could have dreamed during those desperate early days. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Below them, they could see their ranch spreading across the landscape, the cattle grazing peacefully, the horses in the corral, smoke rising from the chimney of their much-enlarged cabin. In the distance, they could see Samuel working with Thomas, training a new horse. Closer to home, Rose was helping James with his reading while Hope played with the dogs. "You ever regret it?" Frank asked, his arm around Josie's waist. "Running away from your old life, choosing this one instead?" Josie leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart. "Not for a single moment," she said. "Everything I endured, everything I went through, it all led me here. To you, to our children, to this life we built together. How could I regret the path that brought me home? "I am glad you ran that day," Frank said softly. "I am glad you asked me for help. You changed my life, Josie. You made everything better just by being in it. You told me to run toward you instead of from my past," Josie reminded him. "Best advice anyone ever gave me. Best decision I ever made, offering you my hand," Frank agreed. They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared. Behind them, they heard Rose calling them for dinner, her voice carrying clearly across the prairie. Frank took Josie's hand, the simple gold band still shining on her finger after all these years, and together they walked back toward the light and warmth of their home. Below them, the land they had claimed and worked and loved stretched endlessly, a testament to what two people could build when they ran toward each other instead of away. The Oklahoma prairie had challenged them and tested them and ultimately embraced them, making them part of its endless story of survival and hope. And as Frank and Josie sat down to dinner surrounded by their children, their laughter filling the cabin they had built with their own hands, they knew they had found what they had both been searching for. Not just land or security or even love, though they had all of those things in abundance. They had found home, the place where they belonged, where their past struggles had given way to present joy and future promise. The cowboy and the woman who had been running from her past had instead run toward each other, and in doing so had created something neither could have built alone. A family, a home, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. It was more than enough. It was everything. As the years continued to pass, Frank and Josie grew old together, their love maturing and deepening with each season. They watched their children grow into capable adults who carried on the values they had been taught. Samuel took over the day-to-day running of the ranch, proving himself as skilled as his father. Rose married a neighboring rancher's son, a good man who respected her independence and fire. James eventually left to become a veterinarian, using his love of animals in a different way. And Hope, their baby, grew into a teacher who educated the children of the growing community. On their 40th anniversary, Martha Peterson, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, organized a celebration that brought people from all over the territory. The cabin that had once been so small now anchored a thriving ranch compound, with the next generation already raising their own children in the houses they had built nearby. Frank and Josie, both gray-haired now and moving a bit slower, stood before their assembled family and friends and renewed their vows. This time it was official, registered with the territory now that Oklahoma was moving toward statehood. Josie no longer needed to protect her claim, the land secured not just in law but in the legacy they had built upon it. 40 years ago, I was running from everything I knew, terrified and desperate, Josie said, her voice still strong despite her age. I asked this man for help, and he gave me so much more than that. He gave me partnership and respect and love. He gave me a reason to stop running and start living. Every day since then has been a gift. She was running from her past, Frank said, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing, and I told her to run toward me instead. It was the best thing I ever said because she did. She ran toward me and then we ran together, building this life, this family, this home. I would not change a single moment of it. They kissed then, to the cheers and applause of everyone gathered, and if their children rolled their eyes at their parents' continued romance, they did so with affection and secret hope that they would be so lucky in their own lives. Frank passed away quietly one spring morning at the age of 78, Josie beside him as she had been for nearly 50 years. He simply did not wake up, his heart finally resting after a life of hard work and deep love. Josie grieved him fiercely, but without regret, knowing they had made the most of every day they had been given. She lived another 5 years after his death, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. She remained sharp and engaged, still offering advice about ranch management and horse training, still telling stories about the early days when the territory was wild and new. On her deathbed, with her family gathered around, she looked at each of them and said, "Remember that you always have a choice. You can run from fear and pain, or you can run toward hope and love. I chose hope, and it gave me all of you. Choose wisely and choose bravely." She was buried next to Frank on the rise where they had stood so many times, overlooking the land they had claimed and tamed and loved. Their simple headstones bore their names and dates, and beneath, a single inscription that summed up their extraordinary, ordinary life together. They ran toward each other and found home. The ranch they built continued for generations. The land still worked by their descendants, the legacy of two people who had both been running from their pasts and found their futures in each other. The story of the cowboy and the woman became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not run away, but run toward the person reaching out their hand, offering not rescue but partnership, not control but love. And on quiet evenings when the wind blows across the Oklahoma prairie, locals swear you can still see them there on that rise. Two figures standing close together, looking out over the land they made their own through courage, hard work, and an enduring love that neither time nor hardship could diminish. They had been strangers once, brought together by chance and choice in equal measure. But they had become something far greater, partners, lovers, parents, and finally, legends in their own right, a testament to the transformative power of running toward love instead of from fear.